Jessica, welcome to the podcast. It's been quite some time since we last connected.
Yes, it has been. When did we last see each other? Sometime last year.
Yeah, well, I think have we seen each other since the seminar?
We saw each other on level 4B
Oh,
in trans.
4B. Yeah.
Yes,
So that
that's
was that was a bit a year ago.
yeah, yeah. So quite some time.
Yeah. And then before that probably was the seminar, so levels 1 to 3 in transformational breath.
Yeah,
So it's nice to be able to kind of catch up and see where you're at. I think you've been quite busy since since 4B. But before we dive into all of this, are you happy just to share a little bit about you and your background and what you do?
yeah, absolutely. So I'm a trained nutritional therapist, registered with BAND here in the UK, and I'm also a certified transformational breath group leader. So I worked in hospitality for about 10 years before I retrained in nutrition. And I think that, like with so many other people who are in health and wellness, the main reason why I retrained was because of my own kind of health journey as such. Um, I had I'd experienced some health problems following the birth of my first son. So I was really unwell during that pregnancy and had a very traumatic birth with him. And I think that in combination with just going from a very busy social life, working in hospitality, to being at home with a little baby became like the perfect storm for both feeling quite unwell, both physically and mentally, to be honest.
Mm.
And then going through the journey of, being told that everything seemed to be fine and I really felt like I should be kind of back to normal, but I just didn't really feel that way. And that then kind of propelled me into looking into other ways to support my health and well-being. And nutrition was one of those things where I really found that it actually made quite a significant difference. And that's why I then decided that that was an area I wanted to train in. And I think with me having worked in food and always loved cooking and baking and all those things, it felt quite natural to take that route and just still be in food in a way, and
Mm.
but instead using it to support other people. So that's how I ended up in nutritional therapy.
And
And
then
then
how did that sort of where did the breath work sort of come from?
yeah, so so breath work really came during COVID, I would say. So I was a finished nutritional therapist in 2019, kind of just a few months before COVID kicked off. So when when we went into the first lockdown, I was setting up my own business and I was also homeschooling. I've got three little boys. And it was just overwhelming trying to juggle the kind of business and motherhood and suddenly almost being a teacher and all these things. So I actually listened to a podcast and heard about breathwork. And I've always been someone who's really interested in trying different things when it comes to health and well-being. So it just sounded really interesting and something that I wanted to try. So I did a transformational breath session with someone in my area and found it mind blowing.
Mhm.
I was really blown away by that session, and I don't even really know still how to kind of describe it. It was just a whirlwind of emotions, and yeah, it was a very full on 1 hour, I would say, which when I left, I just thought to myself, gosh, I really need to do this again. and and then that's how I kind of how it made me move into breath work as well. And like you mentioned, I met you then at the seminar, which was kind of the next step to take this further in the breathwork modality that we're both trained in, transformational breath. And that week was once again really powerful week, and then it just kind of grew from there. And I didn't initially intend to maybe do it for work to start off with. It was more for my own
Mm.
benefit. But then quite quickly realized that it was something I really thought I could use in my practice, and something that could really benefit the people that I was working with. So that's now where I'm at, really combining the two. And I find it, yeah, it's just a fascinating area to work in.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is fascinating. And the community as well is,
Yeah,
I think we're very blessed. Nutritional therapy has such a wonderful community, and
yeah,
transformational breath has such a wonderful community.
yeah.
So it's a real kind of privilege, I think, to be in both ultimately. But one of the reasons why I wanted to invite you on was, I guess, partly because of that journey. You know, you've been
Yeah.
nutritional therapist, you've gone through the entire transformational breath sort of training. And I was curious, I guess, to see how perhaps things have shifted for you, because certainly with my own journey, and I think it's true for nutritional therapists generally, so to speak, as we learn and as we build our experience, perhaps our own perspectives and philosophies shift with that as well. So are there any like obvious ways that you think your work has changed or will change as a result of all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a real interest in psychology. I'm not a psychologist, but I've got a degree in psychology. And I think that of initially starting off kind of training in nutrition, I had a really big focus on nutrition, as you do,
Yeah.
because what you're learning about. But I think working with clients over these last few years, I've realized more and more just how many different parts there is to health, and that so many times maybe not actually the first avenue or focus of the work that I do with someone might not necessarily even be nutrition, um, like to the extent that I would have maybe done from the beginning.
Mm,
I started off. So, for example, you know, if someone comes to see me and they're struggling with gut symptoms or whatever it might be, if they're not sleeping at all, then my route to take would maybe not be first focusing on, okay, you should be eating this and that. It's just having a much kind of holistic and bigger picture view, I think, for me.
mm,
And I think definitely with the breath work, just I think the main thing for me with breath work is connection. Like there's so many positive actual physical aspects and then mental and emotional, but I think with breathwork for me, it's really been about connecting to myself and the same with the people that I work with, and also to people around you, and even the kind of bigger picture, what's around us.
mm,
Um, and I think a lot of the time, certainly for myself, looking back now on my own health journey, I think that a lot of the things that actually helped and supported me during the time, even though I might have thought of it as being, oh, it's because I'm eating this now and I'm doing this now, I've seen was that during that time when I felt better, I was maybe spending more time with my family, or I had a better kind of social network. And there were so many other things that I maybe didn't see as much at the time, or I wasn't as stressed with my work. And there's just so many different aspects. Or maybe one of the boys wasn't as young anymore, so I got more sleep. So for me, it was like, okay, it's the food. I've done this, I've done that, I've done this. But looking back, it's like there were loads of pieces to that puzzle why I probably felt better. And I think that's been probably the main thing of trying to look at the bigger picture and see what's really going on for someone, before necessarily diving in really focused. That needs to happen at times as well. I'm not saying that that's not what I do, but
mm.
generally speaking, I think more about stress, sleep, breathing, even things like connection, like the social networks that people have. If they're doing things that they actually enjoy. I
Mm,
don't know how many times I feel like people get so caught up in the day-to-day lives that they forget to do just little things that they enjoy, and even just incorporating more of that can make such a huge difference for someone.
yeah.
uh, so those are I think those are like big things that I've thought about over the years.
Yeah, and I think that last one in particular resonates for me. I think if I look at my own health journey, there's a fairly clear correlation between when I've been at my best and when I've been doing things that I want to be doing, and having a bit more fun in life ultimately at the same time. And as you say, having that bigger picture, and I think having a practitioner that's going to be asking those questions a little bit as well, and just doing a little bit of compassionate inquiry, to steal Gabor Mate's sort of term, around those things, and helping people understand that they matter as much.
Yeah,
So I've sometimes thought that, I think with everything out there on social media and on Dr. Google, etc., it's becoming increasingly easy to put basically health within the context of sort of just nutrition.
yeah,
It seems to be by far the most predominant area that gets discussed these days. And obviously, we all know that exercise and sleep and stress are big ones, and they're spoken about more and more. But there's so much in the nutrition space and the supplement space that it still dominates, I think.
yeah, absolutely. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think one big thing that I think about at the moment now with people, and also like that's resonated with myself, is creativity. And creativity can be so many things. I think the times when I've not felt very good have definitely been the times when that comes back to the whole doing things that you enjoy, which is really when you're often being creative. And I think that those times when I might have not felt well, and also the same with seeing clients, is when they're just not expressing themselves, whether it be creative in the words or creative in painting, or anything, that you can be creative in so many ways.
Mm.
uh, and that is something that I really really feel quite strongly about now, that I maybe neglected, definitely for my own sake in the past, but that I just think is essential.
Yeah. I definitely know there's some interesting stuff looking at sort of creativity, just from a general resiliency perspective. Um,
Yeah,
and ultimately, I think that's what we're always trying to do, isn't it? Whether we realize it or not, or whether we use that wording, it's essentially get more and more resilient. Um, so with that in mind, um, how do you, I suppose this is a bit of a tricky question, but is there a framework, or is it really just inquiring around all of these different areas to then have a discussion with that unique individual around what needs to happen and how you would support that person?
um yeah, it's a tricky question.
Put you on the spot with that.
Yeah, no, that's fine. No, I do think that yeah, I think it's quite individual in
Mm,
terms of the person that I have in front of me. Um, I don't want to say I get a feeling for the person. It just sounds like it's very kind of vague, but I do think that in a kind of initial, quite comprehensive, like meeting with that person, I do tend that you can get, quite oftentimes at least, you get quite a good idea of what the life is like for that person.
mm,
And then seeing, and often the client will express themselves, saying that I'm really struggling with my job at the moment, or I'm finding out no time for myself. Um, also, if you see that someone's got a lot of children, you can probably also guess that there might be some
yeah.
neglecting themselves in that. But I don't think I have a kind of set
Mm,
checkbook thing. It comes quite organically, I think, in the discussions. And so um, I also work with quite a few people who have disordered eating. So I'm trained in working with people with eating disorder. And I think that in itself has shifted how I work as well, because if someone has struggled with disordered eating in the past, it's quite dangerous if you become really restrictive, or if you say that certain foods are I would never say that certain foods are bad or good, but there is a lot of that. If you start, like you mentioned, Googling online, it's very black or white often. And it's really not like that most of the times. You know, it's not necessarily that there's no one who can eat gluten or no one can eat dairy. There's a real nuance to what people, and you know, it's really dangerous to kind of start saying that certain foods are bad and not. And it's just, yeah, that's something that I find quite frustrating.
Yeah.
In the nutrition world, that it can be just so this or that. And yeah, when in fact it's really individual. And you know, I think we're noticing now as well, you know, with people, whether wearing blood glucose monitors, seeing that certain foods might affect someone massively and then someone else not at all. So there isn't really that one size fits all in nutrition. Obviously there are certain guidelines that most people can probably benefit from. You know, like there are certain kind of ground rules in a way with what we maybe should be focusing on, like fresh foods and, you know, cooking if we can at home rather than eating kind of pre-made foods. But there's, you also have to start where people are at. So you're working with someone who really hasn't got time to cook at all, then there's no point to have this long list of this is what we're going to do every week, because it's just not going to happen. So I think that is something that's really important.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's so contextual, because going back to this idea of whatever it may be, gluten or dairy or anything else, that an individual might be able to tolerate it at one point in their journey and not another, and that could fluctuate over a period of years, ultimately, depending on what else is going on. And I always describe that as health and dis-ease are both just sort of accumulative ultimately, and it's almost like we've all got our own unique threshold, whereby once we step over that, that's when, you know, whatever symptom is going to manifest is going to manifest. And that could be related to a food reactivity, or that could be related to brain fog, fatigue, or literally anything ultimately. And I think if we frame things from that sort of perspective, then we can understand that actually we don't have to pigeonhole ourselves into food as the thing that's going to get me to where I want to be. It can be quite liberating, I think, ultimately.
Absolutely. And I think, yeah, I loved what you just said. And you know, there's such an importance also of balance, I think, in all of it. You know, there is the enjoyment of eating, you know, having a piece of cake with a really good friend and just having a nice conversation is probably better for you. Maybe not every day, but, you know, than sitting on your own and you know, having this meal that might on paper be extremely kind of good for you, what someone might call good for you. So there really is that social aspect of eating, and you know, the connections that we make, and just enjoying what we do, I think is just so key. And I think it's very easy if you're in nutrition, or when you, especially if you go into nutrition, to get quite sucked into it and almost get obsessive about what you should do or shouldn't do, or what to focus on. That it's just easy to forget that food is so much more than just what's on your plate.
Yeah.
It's the building blocks, and you know, you want to nurture yourself, but that there just are so many other aspects to it.
Yeah, I mean, you remind me of, I think it was Chris Kresser's quotes that I read years ago, just along the lines of there's more to health than nutrition, and there's more to nutrition than health.
Yeah.
And I think it was Chris Masterjohn who once did just a little sort of social media post. He was wearing a heart rate variability sort of device, and he found that actually his heart rate variability improved after he went on a friend's stag do. And you know, they were out late, they were drinking alcohol, he expected it to kind of tank a little bit, but actually, because of the amount of laughter and just fun and connection he had with his best friends, it was almost like his physiology was able to buffer the stress, so to speak, of kind of a bit too much alcohol and the lack of sleep. And that for me is a really good example of how important sort of these other areas of health and lifestyle are.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think yeah, it really is just such a game changer, I think, a lot of the time when you start looking at the bigger picture and not necessarily just focus on the very small details. But like I mentioned, obviously there are times when you need to really kind of go with the, you know, focus
Yeah.
rather than the picture. But generally speaking, I think that's definitely something that I've moved more towards as I've kind of worked more in this field. But I mean, I love nutrition, I love food, and there is, and I'm really excited, you know, that there is a lot more talk about nutrition. Obviously, there are the extremes, but it's lovely to hear. I remember when I kind of started off studying, I felt quite conscious sometimes about how people would like that I would be judged if I ate something that would on paper be kind of unhealthy, and now I don't care so much about it. Or I'm just quite honest and just say, well, this is me. I like to have this every now and then and that every now and then, and that's how my philosophy in terms of everything.
Yeah.
Did you find that well, that you would feel judged when you were having
Yes,
big
definitely.
cake or drinking some wine or something?
Yeah, I did. And you know, it's interesting that because you get those comments, or I used to get them an awful lot around it could be a friend or it could be a stranger, but they would make a comment around you eating it or drinking X, Y, and Z, and the fact that you're a nutritional therapist. And it shows you the kind of, I guess, the confusion and the fact that so many of us don't have that kind of bigger picture. Ultimately, they think if you're a nutritional therapist or a health advocate that you've got to be 100% um you know, aligned to it. And I guess even saying that, I'm like, well, actually you're still aligned to it even if you are consuming some of those
Yeah,
things.
of
That's
course.
the context.
Yeah,
And I think one of the biggest mistakes that I see and that probably I've made is we seem to be really good at avoiding something because there's it might be a legitimate reason. There's one reason to not have it, and we kind of seem to attach ourselves to that reason, forgetting that there might be 10 reasons to have that same food.
yeah,
There seems to be a negativity bias towards food that I see, especially in sort of on social media when we're talking about these things. It's always a reason why not to have X, Y, and Z. Uh,
yeah.
and it seems to be quite a common mistake.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think actually one of the main things that I try to do with people is adding in rather than taking away. So
Mm.
thinking what can we add into this person's life rather than taking away. So focusing on that more, because that, like you said, that negativity bias when it comes to food, it's just so ingrained, I think, in us in a way. But when you then start thinking about having this positive outlook on, you know, knowing that someone might be, you know, not necessarily getting all the nutrients that they need, then adding in rather than taking away. And it just, I don't like restricting. I think what it comes down to.
Yeah.
Not good in my mind in most ways.
Mm.
But I think when it comes to, and I think also with the kind of work that we're doing, it's not only about feeling judged myself. I feel often when I tell people what I do, it's like they're straight away going, I don't eat this every day. I usually eat a lot better than I do. I feel like I kind of have to say, oh, do you know what? Like, I really am not super strict. You eat what you want today, like, you know, like it's
Yeah.
there is that also where people kind of go, oh my god, now I can't eat these crisps in front of her, which is quite it's sweet in a way, but I also feel like there is that I don't want people to feel judged.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what was I going to say? There's something that I definitely used to do a lot of it's gone now. It might come back to me. But yeah, I think, you know, those pressures that we can put on ourselves and sometimes are put on us around that is it's a real sign of kind of, I guess, where we're at with our understanding of all of these things. And I'm definitely an increasing advocate of thinking about that bigger picture. Because otherwise, you know, it's a real rabbit hole, isn't it, ultimately, because you can pretty much find a reason not to consume any macronutrient or any food out there. And I think there was the thing that did the rounds recently on the investigation of some dark chocolates and the amount of some heavy metals, I can't remember which ones, that are in it. And I think we all leaped on it saying, oh my God, I need to change my brand of dark chocolate. But there's that context that often we don't take into consideration. We kind of take the headline and then run with it. But, you know, how much is in it per 20 grams of dark chocolate that you might be consuming a day, and what's your capacity to eliminate these things that we are all being exposed to at different levels.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you take it that far, then, you know, you've got to start thinking about the quality of the air that we breathe, and then we all have to leave cities. We're going to just, you know, take all of this at face value. And that for me is why what you've been talking about, this idea of adding and thinking about resilience and sort of building health rather than sort of eliminating disease. It's kind of, there's that sort of subtle shift in perspective that I think can be really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was something I was going to say as well that yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that it really comes down to, and this is going to sound like maybe a big word, is self-love in a way, building self-love together with the person. And that can be done in many ways. So in a way, eating well and, you know, feeding ourselves food that's going to nurture us is a way of giving ourselves self-love, because we're looking after ourselves in a bigger picture. And it can also be, you know, having a bath. And, you know, there's so many little things, but the people that we surround ourselves with, all of those things. So with the work that I do, I think that the main thing really is trying to help people oftentimes build their self-love and create a better relationship with themselves through the actions that they do on a daily basis, and building in those small, simple habits that can become habit over time, and taking it in kind of small steps and not jumping straight away to creating this 5-course meals and, you know, all these kind of things. So I feel like I've worked with enough people who've come to me and who've had a very, very restrictive diet already because of all kinds of reasons. And oftentimes it would have been, you know, Dr. Google kind of going through that process, which I completely understand, because at one point that was really somewhere where I was at myself, where I was restricting foods to try and kind of feel better. And now I can look back and see that that maybe wasn't the best thing to do at the time, but to a certain extent for a little while it helped. But then obviously when you restrict yourself too much for a long period of time, you also risk lacking nutrients in you know, it might start off that you feel better, but then longer term it can be quite detrimental. And by then adding in little things one by one, I've worked with quite a few people who have really, even if it's felt like not, the changes haven't been massive, it's really helped them, just trying to look at food in a different way, and like adding in rather than restricting. Because it's also so easy when you've restricted for a long time to actually become quite fearful of foods and what it can do, and then having that mindset in itself is just not very good, and I think can definitely impact how you then might react to certain foods. If you think that you're going to have a reaction, I think you're more likely to actually then be attentive and see that, oh, this is why when I eat this I feel like this, when maybe it's not necessarily the food.
Yeah. Yeah, there is that kind of hypervigilance that can be it can be hard to break, I think. And I've definitely been there myself, whereby you're just thinking so much around food and what foods you can consume and what food you should avoid and how I'm going to feel if I have that food. I remember when I lived at home in sort of I lived at home quite a long time. I was probably in my mid-20s at the time. But my mum used to kind of, in a compassionate way, kind of laugh at me because I would be standing there at the fridge door for like 10 minutes, just trying to figure out what can I actually have that I feel safe to eat, ultimately was the question that I was asking myself. I didn't really realize at the time. It was more like, what can I eat that's not going to give me bloating, etc. But there was a lack of safety around food, and I didn't want to feel that way. And I think dismantling that relationship can take time. But for me, certainly breath work and to some degree psychedelics have been helpful because they get you out your head for starters, and they very much get you in an embodied state, but they allow you to, I think, connect dots. But I think the biggest thing for me is when you're in that kind of meditative state towards, let's say, the end of a breath session, for example, um the depth and the power of the realization is so potent that it really helps change the behavior or the relationship, if that makes sense. Like
Absolutely.
I can have a thought walking down the park or something, and I'll be like, oh, that's interesting, and then sort of wander on to the next thought. But there's something about being in that sort of state that really helps shift things, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, for me, I think personally, breathwork has been such a game changer. Um, it really is. And I think we're so often stuck in our heads. And I think that's the beauty with, for example, transformational breath, that you just, in this mad way, you get out of your head. And it's not so much about thinking, it's more about being in a state where actually you can, in a way, guide the body to tell the mind that you're safe. And I think that there's so many of us who are in our heads, and then it's really difficult to kind of, I think there's, you can do therapy, and talking therapy can be wonderful and super supportive, but there can also be times where you can know in yourself what's good for you, or the behaviors that you might have, but still there are situations that can be really triggering, and in those situations the mind isn't really your friend. And I think that that's one of the big things with breathwork, that you can actually support and shift that mindset by actually changing the how the nervous system adapts and responds, really, and then in a way letting the body tell the mind that it's safe, rather than the mind telling the body, which is trickier in that sense, because the mind has its own ways of doing things regardless of what we want it to do.
Yeah, and I think it's so hard to put into words that kind of stuff and those experiences that you have, whereby you have that true felt sense that actually my body is totally safe.
Yeah,
And that actually you can let go of some of those narratives and stories that we all have, and I still have, around whatever it may be. But as you say, that's why I think I just love whatever it is for that person that gets them out their head. So for me, obviously there's breath work, which is kind of one of my biases, but for others it's just movement and physical exercise. For others it can be dancing.
yeah,
Others, I find that I try and get in the sauna after a gym session, and either in the sauna or just afterwards, I will always have like my most insightful thoughts and experiences, because it's such I think it's because it's such embodied experience of moving the body and then getting into a really hot sauna. I always have such kind of profound insight afterwards. It's really interesting.
yeah,
I think it's just for that sort of reason ultimately. So we all need to kind of explore what works for us, and there's so many different options. Like you were talking about creativity, I guess
yeah.
for others it can be music, and the list kind of goes on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think Yeah, for me personally, music is a big one. And I guess that's creativity in a way, even though I'm not making it myself. It's just kind of listening to that. And also photography and painting and things like that, even though I don't have as much, well, I shouldn't say I have as much time because I could make time. Um, but yeah, those kind of things are just mindful practices as well that can be used, for just kind of being in the flow and getting out of the head
Mm.
and just doing rather than just being rather than thinking.
Yeah, yeah, and it's I guess there's that concept of neuroplasticity within this as well. I think, I certainly look at my 20s and I think I progressively got more and more in my head because that's essentially how I was living. Well, whether it was related to research and doing kind of degree and masters, or whether it was just getting maybe a bit more analytical around my own thoughts, so thinking about my thinking. But it's sort of it can be a positive or a negative snowball, and obviously being in our heads has its benefits.
Oh, absolutely.
But I think there's a tendency to do a little bit too much of it, and especially if we're someone who is overthinking food, and if we're Alex at 24 who was standing at the fridge sort of wondering what on earth to do, then we know that we probably need some practices that can help us get in the body and out the head, and
Yeah.
and that can be, as you say, a real game changer, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, that's a big thing with with some of the people, with working in the fields of not always with people with disordered eating, but it is that there is a real connection there in the terms of disordered eating or restrictive eating with the mind and the body and maybe not feeling at times and just there's often a disconnect between the body and the mind in a way. And I think that the breath work there can be wonderful because often people use food as a means to not maybe feel. We might eat to not feel our feelings, or we might not eat to not feel. And then when you start actually doing things to allow those feelings to come, which can be, you can do loads of things to do that. Breathwork is just one of the things that I think can be helpful, but there's obviously other things as well. But then that can just be such a bridge to allow someone to start connecting to oneself again. Because I think often, whether it's disordered eating or whether it's other kind of mental health problems, or there is that disconnect, which is this overarching thing that I would say is just there. And I think that so many of us have it in general, regardless of whether we suffer from anxiety or depression or anything like that. It's really easy to be very connected, for example, online, but to still feel very disconnected to the world around us in a way. And social media is wonderful in many ways, but I mean, we've seen now in research that people probably feel more disconnected than they ever have before in certain ways, because there's just not that, maybe the physical interaction that we used to have before. And obviously we've had big events quite recently who've also impacted that. But I think with the last few years it's just showcased so much how connection is just a huge factor in health. And whether you can find that online or whether you can find that in any other ways, is individual, I think. But we do have that need for like human contact, and particularly physical contact, whether it's hugging and things like that, or just touch. Yeah, I think there were lots of people who really struggled with that during that time.
Yeah, and I think with the sort of the healing component of this, there's also, I guess, the importance of sort of feeling like you've been seen and acknowledged and heard. And I think, so many practitioners I've spoken to over the years have commented on, maybe they're talking about a case study or something, and this idea that one of the reasons why as a therapeutic relationship it worked was because actually that client, for maybe the first time, felt like a health professional saw them, heard them, believed them, was willing to explore what might be going on rather than just saying kind of it's all in your head. So there's that real kind of just personal connection as well. And as you say, you can't, it's a prerequisite ultimately, isn't it, to healing?
Yeah, definitely. No, I'm 100% with you in terms of, I think so much, obviously not all of it, but there is a really big part there in terms of how well someone does that you work with depends on the relationship that you have with that person or that you build. And I think that don't quote me, but I'm pretty sure that they've seen that the number one thing for kind of estimating or seeing how well someone's going to do when they work together with someone is not necessarily the level of knowledge of the practitioner, but actually the relationship that the practitioner and the client build and create. That is more important than and I'm not trying to take, obviously you have to have some sort of knowledge, but depending on what you do, but that there is that relationship that is so important. It's like the foundation of the work that you do together. And I mean, I've noticed it myself. If I've worked with someone for my own personal well-being, that the people that I might have worked with that I just felt really comfortable with, I would probably do better than if it was someone I felt a bit judged or just didn't feel heard. So there is definitely that aspect there that's just super important.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we can quote you on that, because I agree, though I'm sure there is research around how they've shown the therapeutic relationship is the most important thing in regards to outcomes. And there's a book I keep on meaning, I haven't read it, I keep meaning to buy it and read it, but Pete Williams has mentioned it a few times. There's a book that kind of summarizes that research and the importance of the relationship. And I always think of the movie Patch Adams with Robin Williams.
Yeah.
If anyone listening hasn't seen it, it's a wonderful film that really emphasizes the importance of I guess the relationship in many ways. And so that's always my inspiration whenever I need it from that perspective. Brilliant. And is there anything else, Jessica, that sort of just comes to mind that you'd like to share?
I'm trying to think. Not anything in particular, I'd say. Have you got anything that comes to your mind?
I don't think I have. I mean, there's an awful lot within within that conversation, I think, really. And I do think, again, it's always contextual. So for some people, some of what we've said obviously isn't going to be relevant, but I think what we have shared is some of the most important information for those when it is relevant.
Yes.
Because otherwise we do get stuck and we do go down those rabbit holes, and it can be 2 years later and we're still kind of trying to get over that symptom or that problem which we started with. And I think if I knew, and this is obviously always the case really, but if I knew what I knew now 15 years ago, my certainly early 20s would have been such a different sort of experience, and even my teenage years ultimately. So there's that balance to be had, I guess, between having that knowledge, but also having the wisdom and the experience to be able to take that step back and see how to apply the knowledge, I guess, ultimately. And maybe that's where often we can go wrong when we're kind of trying to do this ourselves sometimes.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, yeah, like you mentioned, I think we've mentioned before, there's a time and place, obviously, for that there's obviously going to be cases where there is a very specific need for something, and by doing that really is a game changer. And I think that the conversation is probably well, it's just my own kind of experience in terms of with working with people, that I think it's where I'm noticing that I'm moving towards, and where there's often so many like bigger things behind, maybe certain things going on, but definitely, you know, there are times that by changing something very specifically, like the diet, or removing something, or adding in something specific, or that can really have a profound impact. But just starting where the person's at, and looking at what's going on in their life, if there's things that you can, simple steps to take, trying to, I think what I try to do now, and I think what's important for people in general, if they think about their health, is to try and make it as simple as possible. Don't start with, okay, I'm going to work out 5 days a week, I'm going to prep all my meals and do this. If you starting from a place where you're working 10-hour days and you have literally not very much time, and I think because if you do that, then you just end up getting really frustrated and potentially quite upset with maybe not achieving that goal that you wanted to achieve. So starting small and building, and then seeing gradual changes, I think is super key for also keeping the motivation and wanting to kind of keep going. Because otherwise, especially if you're someone who's a bit of a perfectionist and wants things to go well straight away, if you then don't actually follow through with everything, it just feels like maybe a failure, even though that's not how to look at it, but it can feel that way. So starting where you're at, I think is really key, and thinking about what there is in your life that might be impacting, whether it is who you're spending time with, or whether you're on your phone really late at night. You know, there can be so many things that impact how we maybe sleep, or if we drink enough water. You know, there are lots of things that we can take into consideration.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. The thought that came to mind as you were sharing that was around that balance between, you can find some really great research, you know, and you can go to PubMed, or you can hear it on a podcast, whatever it may be. But that question of, okay, well, that's really fascinating. How does that change how I should live, like, day to day?
Yeah.
And we so frequently come back to those fundamental things that have to be done. Ultimately, they're prerequisites to healing, prerequisites to optimal health. And then for me, the thought that came up when you were sharing that was, well, do we trust our body's capacity to heal? And I think there's probably, and okay, let's put this from a personal perspective. I think at times in my journey, I haven't had that belief that my body has an innate capacity to heal, and therefore I need to do X, Y, and Z. You know, I need that supplement plan. I need to remove those foods that are going to be problematic. I need to do whatever it is I need to do. But actually, if we can shift that, I think that sense of safety that we can cultivate, that if the body has the ingredients it requires, and if we're doing a pretty good job about at least reducing our exposure to some of the problematic things, then can we trust the process and know that over the next few months, we're going to actually experience some level of healing as a result of that? And I think sometimes that's almost like the magic formula, like trusting the body. And again, thinking out loud, that's probably why breath work can be such a powerful thing, because it puts us into the body and it can give us that sense of trust in the body again.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm with you. I think with breath work, you know, from a personal point of view, one of the really big things with transformational breath is the guidance, is the coach kind of being there, and also the touch. I think that those are really key aspects with that form of breath work, that I also find helps get in the body, because then you actually got someone who's physically telling. Sometimes it can be so difficult to focus on certain, if you've been so kind of not in your body, it can be really difficult to actually feel even sensations in the body. So when someone then might be guiding you to a certain point, you're just having to go there. And I think that those little things can just, over time, if you do it, can just help you get into the body more and start to feel. And that in itself can also then help maybe letting go of things that might have been there for a long time sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Jessica, it's been brilliant. I would love to continue chatting. I've got to unfortunately go, well, unfortunately, I've got to go and talk about the gut-brain axis. So I'm kind of going now to the other end of the spectrum where
Yeah,
I'm going to be talking about specific bacteria and their connection with all sorts of different things. But I think that's what it's about ultimately. It's kind of being able to juggle these two worlds that sometimes feel so polar opposite,
yeah,
same time are intimately connected.
absolutely. Yeah. Good,
Um,
good. Sure. I'm sure it'll be a really interesting
Yeah,
conversation.
it's nice. I think these sorts of conversations I find so nourishing
Yeah,
because there's that breadth, there's that context, there's that sort of broad breadth and depth. This idea that actually we need to take the step back and think about the bigger picture and all of these different pieces of the puzzle that all have to interconnect if we're going to be in vibrant health.
yeah,
So it's almost like a nice rain check before going down into learning about whatever it may be, cellular function and pathways and all of those fancy things that can be quite interesting, but then reining it back and thinking about some of the things that we've thought about today. So thank you so much
Oh,
for sparing some time and coming and sharing your journey and some of what you've learned over the years. It's been really nice to connect again.
thank you. No, it's been lovely. I was really excited when you contacted me to have.
Where can people find you, Jessica? If they want to learn a little bit more or reach out to you, where are the best places to connect?
So I'd probably say Instagram. So I'm under Jessica Kanerva on Instagram. Got a website as well. But I would say that Instagram's probably the best place to start. So I share quite a bit of food on there, and yeah, mixture of breath work and food and
Brilliant.
lots of things wellness.
Excellent. Okay, and we'll put links to all of that into the show notes, so if people want to check it out, they can do so easily. And hopefully, Jessica, we'll catch up again soon.
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to. Thank you so much, Alex.
That's okay, my pleasure.